Okay, so let's get right into it. We've all heard these stories, right? The government getting involved in family matters. But what actually keeps that power in check? What's the fundamental promise of fairness that the government makes to you and your family? Well, the answer goes right to the core of what it means to be a citizen.
And this isn't some new legal trick, you know? The answer lies in this incredibly powerful, centuries old idea that's literally written into the Constitution. It's meant to be a fundamental shield for every single one of us against the power of the state.
And there it is, due process of law. Just a few words, but they are without a doubt some of the most important in the entire Constitution. They're a promise. They're basically the government's own rulebook for itself, saying it has to play fair before it can try to take away something as basic as your liberty or your property.
So, where did this whole fairness rulebook idea even come from? You might be surprised to hear it wasn't invented in America. Nope. Its roots go back, way back, nearly 1,000 years.
It all started with the Magna Carta, all the way back in 1215, when a bunch of barons basically forced a king to promise he'd follow the law of the land. And from that moment on, this idea has always been about one thing: protecting people from a ruler just doing whatever they want. Then, the founders put it in the Fifth Amendment, making it a rule for the federal government. And later, the 14th Amendment made sure that same exact promise applied to your state and local governments too.
So, we have this big constitutional promise. How does it actually work in the real world? Well, it actually gives us two very different but equally important kinds of protection. And it all boils down to this really clean split. You have procedural due process, which is all about the how. Did the government check all the boxes? Did it follow the right steps? And then you have substantive due process, which is about the why. Does the government even have a good enough reason to get involved with your rights in the first place? So let's talk about procedural first. You can think of this as the government's mandatory checklist. Before it does something major, it has to give you notice, it has to tell you what it's planning to do, and it has to give you an opportunity to be heard. It's the absolute bedrock of fair play in our legal system. Okay, now this one's a whole different level. And to be honest, it's a lot more controversial. It asks a way deeper question. Does the government have any right to be interfering at all? This idea says that some of our rights are so fundamental, so important that no process, no matter how fair it seems, can justify the government messing with them. Okay, so we have these two big legal concepts. Let's bring them down to earth. How do they actually apply to one of the most personal, most fundamental parts of our lives, the bond we have with our family? And this isn't just some fluffy, sentimental idea. It's cold, hard legal fact. Listen to this quote from a court case. "The courts have said again and again that the bond between a parent and their child is a form of liberty. That right to companionship is protected by the Constitution itself. The government can't just brush it aside." So who gets to claim this powerful right? Well, it's held by both the parent and the child, separately. But, and this is the really important part, it takes more than just a biological connection. The courts are looking for a real established relationship. They want to see what they call consistent involvement. It's about the commitment to being a parent, not just the DNA, that earns you this constitutional protection. Okay, so let's start with procedural due process, the how. When we're talking about something as serious as the family bond, what specific steps does the government absolutely have to follow? So as a general rule, the government can't just roll up to your house and take your kid. No way. They need a court order. They need to go to a neutral judge first. The only, and I mean only, exception is a real emergency. And the legal standard for that is incredibly high: imminent danger of serious bodily injury. That bar is high for a very, very good reason. And this is where the courts have really drawn a bright line in the sand. I mean, look at this list. These are all potentially very serious problems, right? Of course they are. But the courts have said that none of these things by themselves rise to the level of imminent danger. Even if these things are happening, officials still have to follow the procedure. They have to go get that court order first. But what if the government's action is just so awful, so completely beyond the pale, that the procedure itself doesn't even matter? That is exactly where that second type of protection, substantive due process, kicks in. Now, we're not talking about a simple mistake or a case of negligence here. The shocks the conscience standard is reserved for government actions that are truly oppressive. We're talking about conduct so brutal and offensive that it just violates our most basic sense of fairness and decency.
So how do the courts figure out if an action actually shocks the conscience? It really comes down to one critical factor: time. Was it a fast-moving, split-second crisis where the official had no time to think? If so, you have to prove they acted with a purpose to harm. But if they had time to think, time to deliberate, the standard is a bit lower. You just have to prove deliberate indifference, that they knew there was a huge risk and just decided to ignore it.
This case makes the distinction absolutely crystal clear. So the officer is shooting at a suspect who just stabbed someone and is running away. The court looked at that and said, okay, that's a split-second, legitimate law enforcement action. But the stomping happened after the threat was over, after the suspect was on the ground, after the officer had several seconds to walk around and think. That second action, the court said, was totally different. It wasn't about law enforcement. It could show up purposed harm.
Okay, so let's bring it all home. Let's tie this all together. How does all this legal stuff, this due process, actually work to protect your family? It really just boils down to two key questions. First, the procedural question. Did the government play by its own rules? Did they get a court order, or was there truly an imminent danger? Second, the substantive question. Was the government's action itself so abusive, so outrageous, that it shocks the conscience? Two different questions, two different ways to hold power accountable.
And that brings us right back to the fundamental tension at the heart of all this. The Due Process Clause, it gives us the framework. It gives us the rules for this incredibly difficult balancing act. But the ongoing debate, that constant struggle over exactly where we as a society should draw that line between the state's power and a family's right to be together, well, that's the very definition of liberty in a free society.